Boldwood presents This Changes Everything, written by Helen McGinn and read by Willow Nash. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Part 1. Chapter 1. Annabel Armstrong had loved James for as long as she could remember, but on this particular morning she wanted to tip the contents of her half-full cereal bowl over his head. It wasn't that he was being deliberately unhelpful, but rather he was so busy rushing around the kitchen asking who'd moved his keys, answer him, he didn't seem to notice Annie could really do with a hand. The boys had to be fed, teeth and hair needed brushing, and everyone needed to be in the car ready for the school run in the next 20 minutes. Meanwhile, chaos reigned. The noise, shouting from the boys, whining from the dogs, mewing from a hungry cat was ridiculous. Annie contemplated sitting on the floor under the kitchen table, closing her eyes and covering her ears. "Come on, Ruth, eat up," she managed. "I am. I can't eat any faster," Rufus replied dramatically. He really was the slowest eater. "I finished all of mine," said Ned, wiping the last of the cereal from his mouth across the sleeve of his newly washed school jumper. Annie sighed, reaching for a cloth. "Good boy, Ned. Now, let's get going, otherwise we'll be late." "You never say good boy to me when I finish my breakfast," protested Rufus. "If you finished it, I would," said Annie, immediately feeling mean. "Thanks a lot." He looked distinctly huffy. "What's your plan today?" Annie called after James as he headed down the hall. "Oh, you know, the usual," he replied over his shoulder. "Get in, be driven to distraction by people much younger than me, try not to shout at people, come home." James was having a work midlife crisis of sorts. Having spent 20 years working in advertising, changing company a few times as he worked his way up to a management position, he now seemed no longer to be doing the work he loved. As he saw it, he was a glorified babysitter for just about grown men and women who all appeared to be younger, hungrier, and better equipped to get ahead than he was. Cue resentment, inevitably leading to a what's-it-all-for phase. And now he'd started talking about retraining as a woodcutter, or something like that. Annie couldn't quite remember. "Oh, come on, Jimmy, you love it when things are going well. Maybe this is just a, down bit. Things will get better. They always do." "Annie, I love you for your optimism, I really do." He came back to kiss Annie on the top of her head and shout goodbye to the boys. "Bye, Dad," they hollered before careering off into the garden. The sun was out and it was already warm, despite the early hour. They were still just under half a term away from the summer holidays, but there was already a holiday feel in the air. Annie watched them run, dogs in tow, into the garden before she turned to attack the kitchen table. The boys' cereal of choice had a habit of attaching itself to that table like barnacles. A blowtorch really would have been more appropriate than the damp cloth she held in her hand. Her phone rang. It was her sister, Jess, the flashing screen announced. "You okay?" Annie always started her phone calls with her sister with these words. Most of the time everything was, indeed, okay. But with Jess, calls often came with a generous dose of drama, sometimes with a side order of flakiness. Annie adored her only sister, 18 months younger and a few years off 40. "Oh, God, Annie, you won't believe what I've done. Seriously, I have even surprised myself this time," Jess sighed, and Annie could hear her dragging furiously on her e-cig. Annie wedged the phone between her shoulder and ear, ditched the cloth and started to throw hastily made Marmite sandwiches into lunchboxes for the boys. "Go on, I'm all ears." "Well, you know that small, bald, irritating little man in accounts?" "Brian?" said Annie, fearing the worst. "Oh, God, Jess. Please don't say you—" "No, of course not," said Jess. "But he was buying endless shots last night, and I seemed to be drinking most of them. And, things got a little out of hand, and I ended up, with Rob." Annie's shoulders tightened. Rob was drop-dead gorgeous. She didn't know that for a fact, she'd never met him, but according to Jess, he was. He was also married. And as much as Annie berated Jess for doing what she was doing, Jess insisted she was better off being with someone she didn't have to be with. Basically, it meant she didn't have to commit, which Jess said suited her perfectly. It was, Annie thought, a very sad situation for everyone concerned, most of all Rob's wife, who, presumably, had no idea. "Please don't expect me to say anything nice. You know how I feel about it." "I don't expect you to say anything nice. I know it's not good. But this time it was different." Annie's heart sank. This was the moment Jess was going to announce Rob was leaving his wife and they were going to be together officially. Annie waited for the crashing punchline to what was, so far, one of the worst jokes she'd ever heard from her sister. Jess always had someone in tow, usually impossibly good-looking, mostly a good deal younger. She was surrounded by them at work. Her job meant spending long hours in the city, followed by many more hours drinking after work. Having started as an intern in a PR company, Jess now ran a successful business of her own. She worked ridiculous hours, was surgically attached to her phone, owned one of the most envied address books in the city, and was both loved and ever so slightly feared by those who worked with her. No doubt about it, Jess was incredibly good at what she did. But years of working in such a brutal environment had left Jess with skin so thick she couldn't remember the last time she'd cried in a movie. Actually, she couldn't remember the last time she'd even seen a movie. Unless you counted the soft porn film a lovely young man called Tom, was it Tom? Insisted they watch in a hotel room in between meetings during a recent conference. But Jess knew that didn't really count. Anyway, back to the punchline. Annie braced herself. "I realised that Rob is, in fact, a bit of a dick." Annie did a silent air punch. "Annie? Are you there?" Jess was thrown by the silence. Yes, I heard. God, I'm so relieved," Annie said. "I'm not saying you have to get married or anything, but getting involved with someone like that, who's capable of doing whatever it is you do behind his wife's back, is just a complete waste of time. Not to mention potentially life-changing for all concerned when the truth comes out. Which it always does," she added. Jess took a deep breath, determined not to rise to her sister's predictably pious delivery. "It's not always that simple, Annie. There's more to it, though I don't expect you to get it." But however much Jess wished otherwise, she knew Annie was right. No matter how good Rob made Jess feel, he was cheating on his wife. This was her first affair with a married man, and though she had thought she could do it, she had since realised she just wasn't able to live a lie. It had been the sight of Rob in her flat just a few hours earlier, trying to put on his boxer shorts and tripping in the dark as he'd made his way to the bathroom to make a hushed phone call. At that moment, he had looked ridiculous rather than ravishing, as he'd done in the bar. The shots had become a distant memory, unlike the hangover she'd then nursed as a consequence. "I'm just so glad you've seen him for the slimy greaseball he obviously is. You deserve so much better," said Annie. "Well, just don't go on about it. Let's just pretend it never happened, and don't, whatever you do, tell Mum." "Course not." "Have you spoken to Mum?" "Why, what's she done?" It was Jess's turn to sound weary. "Nothing. She's fine, actually, but I know she'll ask me if I've spoken to you in that she never rings me kind of way." "Tell her I'll be down in a few weekends' time. I'll book a table at the Fox. We'll go for lunch and have a proper catch-up." Annie knew there was only a very slim chance of this actually happening, but the idea that it might cheered her immensely. Despite Jess's flakiness and serious lack of moral compass at times, Annie loved her sister deeply, and she desperately missed Jess's company. Although separated by just 100 miles of motorway, their worlds seemed so very far apart. Annie hadn't always lived in the country. Once upon a time, she had lived and worked in London, racing to the tube in trainers, ready to be at her desk by 9 a.m, despite often nursing a considerable hangover. Having taken a temping job covering for a sick friend at an art gallery, Annie had gone on to become the first port of call for all the artists the gallery represented, a role she loved. It might be a great British artist on the phone one minute, followed by a complete unknown who hadn't sold a painting for years the next. and Annie's skill, not that she'd realised it, was treating each artist exactly the same. From her quietly spoken pinstripe-suited boss, who used to tell her jokes and deliver the punchline in Latin, to the extremely beautiful willowy PA, Caro, with whom she'd shared an office, along with all the wonderful artists she'd dealt with daily, Annie had adored everyone and everything about working there. Now she sighed, sweeping a look across her kitchen, which, she noted, was once again liberally decorated with small pieces of stray Lego. The white-painted walls looked two-tone, bearing the marks of sticky fingers and the odd felt-tip pen scrawl from about child's head height downwards. Plates, pots and pans balanced precariously by the sink, evidence of the seemingly endless meals Annie had to dole out every day to people both big and small. A basket of washing sat on a chair, the arms of crumpled shirts hanging out as if making a half-hearted attempt to escape from the mess. Standing in the middle of the kitchen was a worn, zinc-topped oak table. It had been found years ago in an antique shop whilst Annie and James were on holiday in Cornwall, and Annie had insisted on tying it to the roof of the car to transport it back to their first flat in London, where it took up most of the main room. Securing it to the roof rack had severely tested her and James's knowledge of knots, but here it stood, as it had done for the last 6 years since they'd left London for a small cottage in the country. Luckily, the kitchen was the biggest room in the house. To Annie, their table was a rock in a sea of washing, toys and noise. She picked at a piece of stuck-on cereal as she spoke. "OK, I will. I'll ring you later in the week." "Sorry for being such a fucking nightmare." Jess sounded genuinely contrite. "Don't be silly." Big kiss. "Bye." Annie glanced at the clock on the oven. "Come on, boys, we'll be late," she shouted. The boys ran in, mud on their knees and grass stains on their school jumpers. Deciding it was too late to do anything about that, she chucked the dirty plates in the sink, grabbed their lunchboxes and her bag, and headed to the car. As the boys piled in, shouting and jostling for position, Annie remembered her phone, left on the side. "Seat belts, boys!" She ran back into the house to get it, finding it on the side, ringing. Her mother's name, Julia, flashed up on the screen. "Sorry, Mum, it'll have to wait," she muttered, stuffing the phone into her back pocket and running back to the car. As she went through her usual mental checklist, boys, bags, coats, check, 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 Annie set off on their school run. "Haven't you got your show and tell this morning, Rufus?" she asked. "Yep, and I'm going to talk about Colin," he said, sounding confident. He held up a jam jar stuffed with leaves. "OK, but make sure people don't frighten him," she pleaded. "Mum, snails don't get frightened," Rufus said, laughing. "How do you know? They might. Just make sure you bring him back safely, and then we'll put him back with his friends under the flower pots later." "Fine," said Rufus with a sigh. "Are snails born with their shells?" asked Ned, and Annie realised she had absolutely no idea. Just as she was about to embark on a completely made-up answer, her phone pinged in her back pocket. She knew it would be a text from her mother. A missed phone call from Julia was always followed by a text. Too late to read it now. It would have to wait until after the school run. As the sun shone and the boys continued to argue over the song choice, Annie reminded herself to catch Claire at the gates. They'd been friends since meeting at a pregnancy yoga class in a nearby village hall, both carrying second babies. Annie had fallen asleep during the deep breathing exercises. Claire had nudged her and she'd opened her eyes to find Claire's kind face informing her via stage whisper that the class had in fact finished. To this day, she was in Annie's phone under Yoga Claire, despite neither of them having been back to a single yoga class since. In the months that followed, Annie and Claire had bonded over a love of strong coffee and, in the later stages of pregnancy, a craving for pastries. In those tough early years, when Annie had found herself stuck at home with very small children, permanently tired and often incapable of finishing a sentence or cup of anything hot without needing to do something for someone small, Claire had been exactly the friend she needed. Funny, warm, and definitely more relaxed about the whole parenting thing than Annie, Claire had been a proverbial breath of fresh air when the Armstrongs first left the city. As she dropped the boys at the school gate, Annie scanned the playground for her friend's familiar figure, usually the only one dressed head to toe in faded black among an ocean of blue jeans and stripy tops. As the kids ran across the playground into school, she spotted her across the other side. "Annie? Coffee?" yelled Claire. "Yours or mine?" "Yours," Claire said as she got closer. "Mine looks like it's been burgled." "Done. See you in a mo." Annie watched the back of the boys as they disappeared into class and, walking back to the car, remembered the message waiting for her. She took the phone out of her back pocket and waited for it to ping onto the screen. "Darling, I am going away for a few days. Will explain. Call me ASAP, please. M. Kiss, kiss." For reasons she'd never really understood, her mother always sent Annie text messages in capital letters. Either she'd never found how to take off the caps lock on the phone, or Julia just liked texting in capitals. But Annie always felt that her mother was shouting at her. Julia going away at short notice didn't worry Annie. She was always going away at short notice. Annie loved that her mother was an active, sociable woman in her 70s with a ton of friends and a seemingly endless number of lunches to attend. What did worry her, though, was that Julia felt it needed explaining. The "will explain" bit of the message was a concern. She dialed Julia's number and waited. Half an hour later, Annie sat at her kitchen table, a mug of very strong coffee in her hand and the remaining crumbs of a couple of croissants on the plate between her and Claire. "Oh, I mean, what the actual fuck is she thinking?" Annie shook her head slowly. "I'm sure she knows what she's doing," said Claire. "Oh, come on, Claire, you know what she's like. She really doesn't. I mean, it's like she's decided this is what she's been waiting for. Prince Charming finally shows up, 3 marriages too late, and she goes running." Annie had thought that nothing her mother could do would surprise her any more. Clearly she'd underestimated her. "So, what did she say exactly?" Annie sighed. Julia had answered Annie's call with her usual cheery, "Hello, darling," before saying, "Now," in a way that made Annie sense that what was coming next was going to be anything but run-of-the-mill. "Essentially, Mum's just told me that she's planning to meet the man she says is her first love. She's not seen him for more than 50 years. 50 years! And they're not meeting in any old place. Oh, no, they're meeting in Rome. Bloody Rome!" Annie lifted her eyes to find Claire with a huge smile on her face. "But that's so romantic," Claire sighed. "I mean, she's a single woman. Presumably he's a single man. What's so bad about that?" "Because she's my mother, Claire. Things are never that straightforward, as you well know." Annie raised her eyebrows at her friend. When it came to surprises, Julia had form. Over the last few years, Annie and Claire had in turn each filled in the other on various chapters of their lives and the characters in them. One of Claire's favourites was Annie's description of her mother's romantic history to date, including the part where she married husband number 2, Simon, whilst on holiday in the West Indies, and according to Annie, Julia was slightly drunk on rum punch at the time, and the taxi driver, a man called Winston, was the witness. On returning home, they announced the news to the assembled children on both sides, Annie and Jess, by now both teenagers, and their new twin stepbrothers. Jess had stormed off. Annie had burst into tears, and the boys had simply asked if they could go and watch TV. Not a roaring success, really. Just like the marriage, which lasted less than 3 years. Then there was husband number 3, a kind man called Andrew, ruddy-faced and permanently dressed in a holey green jumper and mustard-coloured cords. He hadn't lasted long either. Too boring, according to Julia. Annie had once asked why her mother hadn't realised that before marrying him, but Julia's answer was typically brusque. "Darling, he was a fantastic bridge partner. I just shouldn't have married him." And that was that. There was, of course, another husband. Number 1 was Annie and Jess's father. His name was David, and Annie had just turned 8 when he left. Jess was 6. Annie didn't remember it as a particularly traumatic event in her life. There were no arguments. She didn't remember either parent staging a dramatic exit. Rather, she mostly remembered them being what she assumed was a normal, happy family, until one day he just wasn't there anymore. Over the years that followed, as she'd grown up and come to understand what her parents were like as people, The idea that they had been together long enough to have 2 children amazed her. They were so incredibly different. As much as her father was calm and straightforward, her mother was flamboyant and unpredictable. Their wedding photo, one of Annie's favourite pictures, showed Julia standing in a very short miniskirt, David in a sober suit, proud-looking parents on either side. Both bride and groom wore shy smiles. They'd met in a pub in London when the town was in full 60s swing. Julia worked behind the bar. David was there by mistake. When Annie thought about her parents as a couple, she didn't really have many memories to go on. Even when she really concentrated, she couldn't picture her parents together, other than in that one wedding photo. Anyway, now there was another man in the picture, according to Julia. Apparently he's called Patrick. They met as teenagers and Mum says he was her first love, said Annie. So why Rome? Asked Claire. God, I don't know. I didn't ask. What I don't understand is why he's got in touch now, after so many years, and why Mum thinks it's such a good idea to go. I mean, she's got no idea what he's like now, where he's been all this time. Who knows what he's after, cried Annie. But that's the thing. She obviously does know what he's like, if they were in love once, said Claire encouragingly. It's just so... Annie's voice trailed off. Julia, replied Claire. It is just so Julia. Annie had to smile at that. Her friend was spot on. So, how did he get in touch? He wrote a letter. Oh, that's too gorgeous. Claire clasped her hands together in delight. Yes, maybe, but it creeps me out that he knew where to find her. I mean, he might be stalking her. Hardly. You don't stalk someone by asking them to meet you in Rome. How did he know where to find her? God knows. I didn't think to ask her that either. I'm still getting over the fact that she's going to meet him. Oh, come on. Try not to worry. She's a grown woman. She'll be fine. And she'll have a wonderful time. I mean, it's Rome, said Claire. I know. But to be honest, I'm just not sure I can face meeting husband number 4. Annie picked at the last of the crumbs on the plate and drained her mug of coffee. Talking of which, it's our wedding anniversary tomorrow. 10 years. Oh, wow, Claire cried. That's a big deal. Are you going to do something to celebrate? Not sure. James usually plans something. Not that he's mentioned it yet. Annie smiled. Claire hoped he hadn't forgotten, not least for his sake. Given that Annie had seemingly already decided that another stepfather was on the horizon, Claire thought she might just need something to take her mind off that. Chapter 2. Are you going to ask me or not? Were the words Annie had said after kissing James for the first time, standing outside the local village hall after a friend's birthday party. They were both 17. Annie remembered him wearing an old, oversized long coat, the underlying mustiness disguised with a generous dash of Dunhill aftershave. Annie was in her brown suede jacket, bought in a second-hand shop in Kensington Market. With the faint sound of Bryan Adams singing about everything he did in the background, James and Annie found themselves outside together, talking as they shared a turquoise cocktail cigarette stolen from Julia's stash in a drawer in the kitchen dresser. The smoke curled slowly in the cold autumnal air, and the 2 teenagers talked about life as they knew it. About James taking his driving test, which he planned to do as soon as possible. Of course, this wasn't the only reason that Annie had liked him, but, looking back, she had to admit it was a contributing factor. Having been friends through school for years, a run of teenage parties had thrown them together more than usual. Both made braver through warm beer. This time they had ended up in the car park in a slightly awkward teenage embrace. Annie was thrilled, and prompted by Annie, James had asked her out. Not that they went anywhere in particular in those days. The odd trip to the cinema, the occasional walk with the family dog in order to talk without parents around, and smoke more stolen cigarettes, obviously. Annie's university years took her to Scotland to study art history. James, on the other hand, couldn't wait to get on with it, his words, and soon got a job with a small advertising firm in London. Despite the distance between them, the relationship worked. There were a few tricky patches, but ultimately they were mad about each other. Whenever they could afford it, they'd meet up and spend hours in a tiny restaurant in James's neighbourhood in North London, making a bottle of wine last for as long as possible so they could stay and talk without having to go back to the flat. Not that the flat was that bad. Rather, James's flatmate, Stig, an old university friend of his brother, loved to do yoga at night, naked. James and Annie would put off returning to the flat until they were sure Stig had finished his sun salutations and downward dogs. By the time Annie moved to London 3 years later, she knew that she too wanted to share a flat with some friends. So it was that she lived with 2 university friends, Bea and Louise, in a dingy place near Vauxhall, where cups fell off the shelves every time a train went past. There was always a bottle of sparkling wine in the fridge, thanks to Bea's job with a city catering company. Louise was studying medicine and knew exactly what to do to shift a hangover. They worked hard during the week, partied on Saturdays and slept on Sundays. It worked perfectly. By the time they reached their late 20s, Annie and James had been together for over 10 years. So when he proposed, no one was surprised. Apart from Annie, that is. It was almost as if she wasn't expecting it. "But how could you not know who was going to ask you?" cried Bea as they sat on the sofa of their flat just a few days after the proposal. "I don't know. I know it sounds weird, but I just didn't want to assume it would happen. I mean, I knew it was going to be him, but I couldn't be sure he knew that too." This was Annie's best explanation. "But can you really marry someone if they're the only person you've ever been with? And that includes sex, by the way," said Louise in her usual no-nonsense medical manner. "Well, I'd always thought that if we met someone else along the way, before we were married, that would be the test. But the thing is, the idea of being with anyone but him makes me feel a bit sick. I've loved him since I was 17. Being apart from him all that time, surrounded by lots of other people, made me love him more. Does that make any sense?" Annie looked at her friends for some kind of understanding. "Darling, I think it's the most gorgeous thing," said Bea with tears in her eyes. "Personally, I think you're both mad. It's not normal. But you're so happy. Cheers to that," concluded Louise, topping up her pint glass with more free Moët. The wedding was a spit and sawdust affair, much to Annie's in-laws' disapproval. Their budget was spent mostly on lots of booze and a really good band. The marquee, more a big tent, was borrowed from the village cricket club and decorated with branches pinched from the nearby woods. Old jam jars were crammed with meadow flowers. It was June, but it poured with rain. The photographer got lost, so most of the photographic evidence from the day was thanks to Stig, a keen amateur photographer. He'd been close enough to capture the bride and groom as they left the church, both with enormous grins on their faces and an undeniable light in their eyes. This particular picture was now framed, just one among a sea of faces crammed onto the biggest wall in the house at the far end of the kitchen. The wall had started with just a few photos in odd frames when Annie and James first moved into the cottage, but over the years the collection had grown. There were plenty of dodgy haircuts and questionable outfits on display during Annie and James's late teenage years. There were shots of Annie or James, rarely both of them, this was pre-selfie days, in various locations, from Venice to Vietnam, all holidays before the children were born. After children appeared, the backdrops behind them were noticeably less exotic. But the grown-up faces in the photographs were just as happy, if a little more tired. And for Annie, it was the tiredness that tested their relationship the most. Nothing had prepared them for the sheer exhaustion of having small children. From the day they brought their firstborn back to their minute, hastily bought one-bedroom flat, life had not been the same. "Where shall I put it?" asked James, motioning to the car seat. It was as if a new but unexpected piece of furniture had been given to them, and they didn't know where it should go. "Him, you mean, not it?" Annie eased herself into the only armchair in the room. "Leave him in there for now, so we can look at him." They both stared in wonder and slight shock at the tiny creature in front of them, fast asleep in the seat. The baby's hat had slipped over one eye, his fingers curled into tight little balls. "Hello, Rufus," James whispered. "Hi, Rufus," said Annie, barely audible. She felt her heart would burst with love. She was elated and terrified all at the same time. Those early days with just the three of them in that flat went by in a haze of broken nights, along with the smell of those hideous little plastic nappy bags. Annie spent hours sitting on various sofas in friends' flats and houses across town over the next few months as they drank endless cups of lukewarm tea. Swapping birth stories, Annie realised hers was mercifully straightforward. The epidural was so effective, she was able to read an old copy of Hello magazine that James had found in the waiting room. In fact, she sometimes felt obliged to make it sound a little more dramatic than it really was. The nearest they'd got to a moment of drama was when James had sprayed deodorant in Annie's face instead of water, having got the cans in the hospital bag mixed up. But then the drugs had kicked in and the baby appeared before Annie had even got to the cookery pages. By the time Rufus started walking and talking, the decision to move to a bigger place had been made, except that finding somewhere even remotely in their price bracket in the area was impossible. When another mother at Rufus's nursery suggested Annie change religion to get Rufus into a good school, bearing in mind he was still in nappies at the time, she knew it was time to move. Not just down the road, but really move, out of the city to the countryside. Annie really hadn't grown up thinking she would end up living in the same village as her parents. In fact, she'd spent most of her teenage years thinking how unbelievably boring it was. But when her mother turned up on the doorstep for a last-minute visit, "I might be in the area, darling," she'd brought with her a copy of her local paper. And Annie spotted a cottage just outside the village where Julia lived, available for rent. It was utterly beautiful, with a small garden and a duck pond on the village green nearby. Suddenly, the idea didn't seem so bad after all. It wasn't as if Annie was going to have her mother there all the time. Julia was far too busy. But she would be nearby, and that felt right. Putting the idea to James had been planned with precision. Beef stew, mashed potato and lots of red wine first. Proposed move to the country second. It meant an hour's daily commute for James to work, who was by now in the office of a much bigger firm of advertisers. But it also meant more space than they could ever have dreamed of. That and the promise of the odd free night's babysitting from Julia swung it. James agreed it was time to make the move. Pulling the van up outside Wisteria Cottage just before Rufus's second birthday on a warm day in July was marred by just one thing. The week before, as Annie and James sat in the waiting room of the London hospital waiting for their scan appointment, she'd known something was wrong. What had started as a dull ache in her stomach the night before was now so painful it scared her. Running to the loo in the hospital just before her scan, Annie saw the flash of red in the water and, feeling like her skin was actually crawling, called out quietly for her husband. What followed was a blur of voices and pain as Annie had a miscarriage right there in the hospital on the day of her 12-week scan. Waking up after the D&C operation, had 2 letters ever sounded so cruel? She looked out of the hospital window at a cloudless blue sky. She'd felt hollow, depleted. James was at her side. He was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. She squeezed his hand, and he squeezed hers right back. A year and a half later, Ned was born. Not quite the stress-free delivery enjoyed with Rufus. Instead, Ned made an early appearance, 2 months before his due date, thanks to preeclampsia. Annie spent weeks in hospital, both before and after the birth, most of the time by Ned's bedside, once he'd arrived. Eventually they brought him home at a healthy weight. As he grew older, he grew fast. To everyone else, Ned was bulletproof. But for Annie, the memory of watching his frail little body attached to wires and monitors with the incessant beep, beep, beep and steady flashing lights was never far away. The sounds of those machines should have reassured her, given that they signalled everything was as it should be, but instead they had made her feel sick. Still, with 2 healthy boys, Annie knew she had much to be grateful for, and she really was. Just as soon as she'd finished folding at least the top layer of the basket of washing on the table, Annie planned to head to the shed at the bottom of the garden to do some work. The shed was stuffed with old bits of furniture, pots of paint and dust sheets, and had a strong smell of white spirit. As much as she wished she could earn a living as a painter, it turned out that sanding down old bits of furniture and painting them was more lucrative in the short term. In the corner of the shed stood an easel and a blank canvas, which she hoped one day she might find the time to paint for pleasure. But in the meantime, she had a set of bedside tables rescued from the tip on the go, which would be perfectly sellable once she'd given them a makeover. As she fished around the basket trying to find the partner to the socks she had in her hand, her phone rang. It was Jess. "You will not believe what Julia's doing now. I mean, for fuck's sake, seriously, she's—" "I know," said Annie calmly. "Oh my God, has she told you?" "Yes, I got a text from her this morning. In capitals, obviously." "Same! Did you tell her she's completely mad?" cried Jess. "Not exactly, no. I don't think that would have stopped her. She's very bright and breezy about the whole thing, like it's the most normal thing in the world to go all the way to Rome to meet someone she hasn't seen for over 50 years. It's weird, but it was like she was telling me she's going to the shop down the road to pick up the paper and a pint of milk, only she'll be gone for a bit longer." "Did you ask her why she was going?" "Yes, but she just said it was something she had to do, and that if we were in her position, we'd do the same." "What position does she mean? I just don't get it. I mean, do you think she's being blackmailed to go? He might be a lunatic. He might cut her up into pieces and put her in the boot of a car for all we know." "Jess, I think that's definitely the worst-case scenario," Annie laughed. "Well, you read these stories, and God only knows what might happen. What if he really is a lunatic, or even a con man? Seriously, Annie, please can you talk some sense into her?" "I don't think it'll do any good, honestly. Sounds like it's all organised. She's going next week." "Next week?" "In that case," said Jess, inserting a dramatic pause, "I'm going to follow her out there." "You're what? Why? What about work?" "Well, actually, I was planning on taking some time off anyway. I need to—" Another pause. "Get away for a few days. From the office, I mean." "Why?" "Jess, what's happened?" Annie frowned. "Nothing dramatic. I just need to... I think it's a good idea if I'll tell you when I see you. It's complicated, but really nothing bad. It's just... I could do with a change of scene. Stalking Julia in Rome will be a fantastic distraction, if nothing else." "What are you going to do? Hide behind statues? How will you find them? You don't even know where they'll be," cried Annie. "Oh my God, why don't you come too? We could go together. It'll be amazing. Come on, Annie. We never get to do things like this. Just for a couple of nights." "I'll pay." Annie started to protest, but Jess went on. "Seriously, please let me. I don't have any time to spend my money, let alone anyone to spend it on." Annie laughed, put Jess on speakerphone and continued to search the washing basket for the missing sock. "It's a lovely idea, Jess, but I can't. Who'll look after the boys?" "Can't James help?" "He's at work. No can do. And anyway, I've got a fancy dress costume to make before next Monday. For Roman Day, ironically. Buy one on Amazon, for God's sake. Life's too short to not do stuff like this, Annie." Jess was not going to let it drop. "Well, I guess that's exactly what Julia's thinking." Jess sighed. "Well, if you change your mind, I'm going to look into flights. Can you find out when she's going and where she's staying? I'll do my best, but you know how vague she can be." "Really? I hadn't noticed." Jess hadn't ever meant to get involved with a married man, but too many failed relationships had left her feeling that she just wasn't right for marriage. She was too selfish, a fact that she was entirely comfortable with. There had been one, years before, that everyone, including Jess, thought would be the one. His name was Ben, and he proposed to Jess on her 30th birthday. So it came as a surprise to her as much as anyone when she turned him down, instead taking a job in New York for the next 3 years. Over time, Annie had learned not to ask why, when it had all seemed so perfect. Julia had never asked in the first place, of course, regarding it as a decision Jess would explain as and when she ever needed to. All Jess would ever say about it was that it didn't feel right. She loved Ben, but she didn't want to marry him. To her, it was as simple as that. Since then, Jess was rarely single, but as far as Annie could tell, never really with anyone either. At least not long enough for Annie to meet them properly, to know what they were like. And when Rob had come along, Annie found it difficult to hold her tongue. It was just not like Jess to do anything that might hurt somebody other than herself. They both tried to avoid it, but whenever the subject of Jess's relationship came up, the conversation rarely ended well. Eventually, it became an off-limits topic, which Annie hated because she wanted Jess to be happy, and she wasn't sure her sister was as happy as she should be, indeed could be if she was with the right person. Specifically, someone that wasn't married to someone else. Jess stood up from her desk, slipped her feet back into her black high heels and smoothed down her knee-length black skirt. With it she wore a simple silk shirt and subtle but achingly expensive jewellery. Her long caramel-coloured hair was swept up loosely. She was tall and whippet-thin like her father. Glancing at her watch, Jess realised that she had to be across town in half an hour for lunch with one of her favourite clients and was running late. She popped her head out of her office and asked her PA to get a cab ready to meet her at the door in 2 minutes. The green juice hadn't helped the hangover, nor had the coffee or the handful of painkillers. Hopefully a plate of shepherd's pie in one of her favourite restaurants would sort her out. Grabbing her coat and bag, Jess checked her phone. One missed call from Rob, and headed for the lift. As the taxi weaved its way through the streets of Soho, Jess was oblivious to the gorgeous early summer day outside. The sun shone, coats had been shed by both tourists and workers alike. With her eyes glued to the screen of her phone, she scrolled mindlessly, scanning the first lines of emails to make sure there wasn't anything that couldn't wait until after lunch. "Here you go, love." The cabbie's voice was her cue to shove her phone in her bag and make for the door. Tapping her card, she thanked him and hopped out onto the pavement. The sight of the enormous revolving door to the restaurant was a welcome one. Jess knew she was minutes away from the comfort of a corner booth and, quite possibly, a cold glass of champagne. She waited for the door to turn, seeing someone coming out as she did. The glass was thick, the wood dark, brass gleaming. In that moment, as she stepped inside, she caught sight of the person going out. It was a split-second look, but enough to make her catch her breath. Tall, dark, but definitely not a stranger. It was Ben. As the door delivered her into the foyer of the restaurant, she turned to look back. The door continued to turn slowly, but there was no sign of him. She went to go back out, but stopped. Could it have been him? She ran through the probabilities on a trip back to London from wherever he was.